Rain began as if it had been waiting for permission, a long drumming that took the tiles of the roof apart and poured itself into the gutters until the whole house seemed to breathe in wet. Lamps flared and guttered in the great parlor. The scent of jasmine in the conservatory folded into the smell of damp earth and turned something sweet into something raw. Standing at the tall window that looked over Joaquim de Andrade's sugar fields, Amélia Vasconcelos felt the rain like an accusation against a life that had been taught to look away. She had said the words earlier, said them into a dark room like a command, and even now they tasted like iron. No mercy, no pity. She had wanted it that way, not because she hated softness, but because she wanted to do something that would not be catalogued and trimmed and put under glass. In a house built on the illusion of ownership, she wanted to be a living thing. The phrase had been an act, not a prayer, an experiment in violence against her own gilded cage. Outside under the mercury sky, the plantation looked like a map of consequence. Sugarcane, row upon row, slicing the land in patient, hungry lines. A thin river off to the east that caught and flung the sky back at itself. Within those acres moved bodies whose names the house kept on a ledger, the overseers' names inked in sure black strokes, the names of mothers and children recorded in column after column. Among them was Caleb. He was the rhythm of the fields, the sound the cane made when it met the machete he held. His skin when wet took on a glow like the inside of a stone. His shoulders rose and fell in the mechanics of a body that did not get to rest its choices. People in the great house noticed his strength the way they noticed the weather, sometimes as an inconvenience to be accounted for, sometimes with a detached admiration that hurt less because it required no seeing. Amélia noticed him differently. She noticed how his hands marked the sugar stalks, how he kept them in patterns like a man who wanted his work to be a language, how, when he passed beneath the wide balcony, the moon sometimes found the line of his neck and turned it silver. Amélia was 28, and her life had been curated like the fabric in her wardrobe. Silk that did not scream of its price, gloves that never caught dirt, an education from tutors who taught the right cadence for a laugh. She knew the rituals of dinner, the precise tilt of her head when Joaquim spoke of his estates. Her husband, Baron Joaquim de Andrade, was a man grown thick in the certainty that he owned not only fields, but the very pattern of speech in his house. He had a face like a slab of old wood, a voice that pressed down on conversation and made it conform. He loved the idea of Amélia because she was a correct reflection of his world. He did not know her hunger. Hortensia, the governess, watched all of them with that particular stare a woman keeps when she has to unmix care from calculation. She knew the household's rituals. She knew also, in the private ledger of women who had watched other women move through constrained marriages, how to read a look on a face and make it into a map of probabilities. Hortensia saw the way Amélia lingered by the balcony of an evening, the way she put her hand on the balustrade and let down the veil of the party she showed to the world. Hortensia had been born in the house and had learned to make herself small and useful, to stitch and to cook and to be the one who smoothed edges. She would, if asked, tell the Baron that melancholy in a wife could ruin a reputation. But she would also, in the silence that followed the candles being put out, lay an extra stitch in a gown and listen. The house, the fields, the quiet servitudes of custom. All of that was a web with its center in Joaquim, a man who trusted a ledger far more than a whisper. He had expectations for his wife, to be the image of respectability, to bear his heirs, to hospitably extend his patronage to the right people. He believed that obedience was a currency that could be spent without cost, because in his world, costs were for other men to pay. Amelia's life, however, had an undercurrent she would not let the parlor air name. There were nights she read novels in Portuguese under her bedcovers until the candles had a pool of smoke, and she fell asleep with the thin, dangerous idea that desire might be something other than a rumor. There were afternoons when she walked the corridors and put her palm against a pane of glass to feel the warmth of the sun from the other side. The house gave her many small comforts. It withheld other things with a vigilance that made a woman into an exhibit. Caleb's life was a ledger of a different sort. Born in the Chenzala behind the main house, he had learned early to count his days in labor and the small rewards that broke off from those days. A cup of boiled corn on a winter morning, a cigarette smoked in secret. He guarded his name as a man guards a private possession, because names in the house could be traded, sold, struck through. Caleb worked with his hands and measured the world in the heft of his own labor. He understood the architecture of being seen. When a mistress looked at him, the look could be curiosity, hunger, messiness, anything, and it always carried the shadow of what it meant within the house's legal and moral geography. They were not at first conspirators. They lived in parallel. She in velvet rooms that smelled of bergamot and policy, he in the field where a hawk could pass and not startle the system. Yet proximity breeds attention. A moment of being watched can bloom until the watcher and the watched become the same constant, two players orbiting a light. Amelia's attention to Caleb did not begin with lechery. It began with an awareness she had not given permission for. She watched the way he lifted his chin when the overseer cursed him, how his laugh was quick and brittle, how he made a small ritual of rolling a splinter of sugarcane between his fingers. She began to imagine things that the house forbade to imagine, a conversation in which she did not have to cough and smooth her words, a touch that was not part of a performance. On the first heavy night of the rains, the household's routine shifted. The staff drew up the shutters. Joachim drank himself deep into the smell of imported port and conversation about land prices. Amelia excused herself from supper with a practiced faintness and climbed the grand staircase 2 steps at a time. Her heart moved like someone suffocating in summer. Hortensia, seeing the way she tightened her mouth, lent her a shawl and said nothing more than, "Do not be without sense, señorita." The refusal of speech was its own mercy. From the balcony, rain made the world wash into dim charcoal. The caged sounds of the night, mules shifting, the distant bark of a dog that had no business wagging, blurred in the downpour. Amelia felt the house around her like a throat. On impulse that she could not have accounted for in the morning, when she would have been taught better, she sent for Caleb. Sending for a slave from the fields at night was its own transgression. There were reasons certain bodies walked the corridors only at certain hours, reasons that had to do with propriety and the unquestionable hierarchy the house maintained. Hortensia must have seen, or perhaps she was the one who placed the message in a bowl and let it go, sliding it through a servant's palm. Caleb received the summons under a lantern and with a face that told nothing. He tied his ragged jacket about his shoulders and came. When he arrived at the balcony gate, he did not linger as a lover might. He stood there, shoulders squared, the rain making lines down his uniform of work. Amelia felt herself become small around him at once and vast. The house had taught her the register of a quiet voice, and she used that voice like a key. She told him simply to enter. Inside, the bedroom smelled of powder and the faint mildew of old books. A lamp threw a figure across the bed, a carved headboard, a man of painted surfaces. Amelia closed the door behind both of them with the exaggerated care of someone who needed to be sure of silence. Then she turned. There are moments in which a woman takes a decision that she will understand later, as both crime and experiment. She wanted to feel honestly. She wanted to break the neatness of the life that had been arranged for her. When she touched Caleb, it was not with the soft curiosity of someone testing a new cloth. It was with a deliberate insistence that this would not be an act of tenderness. She pressed both hands on the sturdy part of his forearm. The skin there was not to be described in exotic terms. It was the skin of a man who had lived under the sun and under hands that demanded results. Caleb did not misread her. There was no mistaking consent, not in that room, not in her look. But consent in a house like Joachim's meant something more complicated than mutual desire. He knew the stakes. He knew that to be wanted by a mistress could be survival and ruin in a single breath. He knew also in the marrow of him that to be desired for his body was to be read by the house's property, to be pinned down beneath labels that would cost him more than the night was worth. Yet there was a humanity in his acceptance. For a few hours they negotiated the unsayable in small gestures, the removal of gloves, the way she put her fingers to the pulse at his wrist, the way he breathed and let down a guard that was older and harder than either of them. They were careful with speech because the house was a thing that eavesdropped. Amelia, who had spent whole evenings practicing the right intonation for amusement, was audacious now in the smallest manner. She spoke what a woman in her position seldom allowed herself to voice. No mercy, she told him, no pity. Her words were not a bargain. They were a command to herself as much as to him. She wanted to feel that her body could be taken beyond the polite boundaries that had taught her to keep a distance. It was not a call for cruelty toward Caleb. It was a call to erase the gentle varnishes that smoothed her emotions in front of the house. She wanted something raw. He obeyed at first because obedience preserved a rhythm he knew, and later because, in the space between their bodies, something unexpected ignited. A recognition that, for a moment, no ledger could write what they were making. It would be wrong to call it liberation, for Caleb and Amélia both carried the weight of their stations, but the night was, in the smallest functioning way, unsanctioned. They crossed a line together, aware of it, and using that awareness like a delicately sharpened knife. There are many ways to tell the first encountering of two people in a room. The house would have called it an indiscretion. The truth was less decorous. Amélia moved like a woman who wished to test the limits of sensation and of her own control. Caleb answered as a man finally permitted to feel what his hands might produce when not bent strictly to another's instruction. Neither of them was innocent in the sense of being unknowing, but both were not fully culpable in the way the law would name them. The law favored one body's testimony over another's. Inside the bedroom, the world narrowed with an immediacy that the house could not contain. When it was quiet after, the sound of the rain had altered, a steady palm in the global pulse of night. Amélia lay with the lamp guttering at the bedside. Every nerve in her was awake and aching in a way she would not have designed for herself. The phrase slipped out, not with defiance now, but with a kind of exhausted triumph. I said, "No mercy or pity." She tasted the words again, felt them as a bruise on the inside of her chest. There was a victory in having said it. There was also a new invasive knowledge that stories have a way of traveling. Caleb dressed in the dusk, buttoning his threadbare coat with his back nearly turned to her. He left the room with the same quiet that had entered, the way a man withdraws from the theatre of someone else's life. On the threshold he paused, and for an instant looked at Amélia. The look was not simply of hunger, but of something like sorrow mixed with gratitude. He had been seen and wanted, but that seeing did not come with the rights it implied in a different world. The house starved men of rights, and fed them scraps of recognition instead. Outside, the rain clung to his shoulders like a cloak. He moved down the stairs in the shadow of the wide banister, past the tobacco-scented study and the portrait of the Baron that hung like a god who had misplaced mercy. Amélia watched him go from the window. When the door closed, the lamp in the corridor clicked and steadied. The house resumed its governance of sound and movement, as if nothing had changed. She sat then on the edge of the bed, feeling the single bruise on her palm where his hand had held too tight. It would be a small thing in the ledger of the house, a mark easily hidden beneath gloves and silence. It was also suddenly a proof. She had done something that could not be entirely asked back. The night had been an act of will. It had not yet produced consequence, but consequence is a patient animal. It thought in arcs, the house understood well, and watched like a priest. Caleb walked back to the quarters with the rain beating time against his hat. In his chest there was a tenderness he had not let himself keep for many years. He was no romantic. He had a brother who had been traded to a fazenda in Minas, and a mother who had died with the knowledge that her name, once spoken, could fit on a ledger. What he felt was a memory of being valued not as a worker, but as a man. The night had afforded him a glance of what might be possible if the world were otherwise. He held that glance like a small contraband treasure, folding it into the part of himself he kept away from other men's eyes. He also knew the arithmetic of risk. In that house, proof could be invented by a jealous overseer, or deduced by a nosy maid who liked the sport of rumor. Men like him had learned how to gather silence around themselves, as if it were armor. The best you could get, he thought, was a favor that was not obvious to the ledger, and a secret you could bury in the fields. Returning to the Cenzala, he kept his steps purposeful, the way men who know they must not be seen in certain places learn to walk, without hesitation, without the shake of a man who had recently parted from someone with whom he'd been intimate. Amélia did not, after the night, sleep well. She turned over the line she had pronounced, and felt the strangeness of its echo. It was not merely its meaning she worried about, It was how words lived in a house that kept minutes and correspondence and a certain moral grammar. She tried to tell herself she had only wanted to be real for a few hours. She tried, as Hortensia might counsel, to compress the episode into the smallest possible intrusion on a life otherwise spent as example. But desire leaves its own traces. The linens smelled subtly different. An imprint of a hand could remain on a pillow. There were, in the morning, a few granules of cane sugar in an unlikely place on the dressing table. Tiny, careless proofs. Hortensia noticed the small change in Amelia's gaze before she saw anything else. The governess, who had always preferred the quiet method of attending to practical matters, made a point of leaving a tray of food by the lady's door and speaking one phrase as she went: "Keep your wits, señorita." She did not ask the reason. She did not need to. In the household, women of their kind learn to avoid certain curiosities for survival. Yet a houseperson's curiosity is rarely contained. The servants' rooms are always, in a way, newspapers of rumor. The next morning, life resumed its constructs. Meals took their measured times. Joachim spoke at length, his voice the same as always, about the price of molasses in Bahia and a land dispute on the eastern boundary. He did not notice the pearlescent look that sometimes crossed his wife's face when she looked at him. He mistook the expression for boredom, or for the melancholy that sometimes accompanies a woman whose beauty has been preserved like a painting. He had not seen her at night, he thought. Why would he suspect? But the house is not made only of two adults. It is a lattice of watchers and instruments. The youngsters in the servants' quarters whispered. A woman who took the kitchen candles noticed the faded pattern of a thumb on the underside of a curtain and thought of matches and of theft. The overseer, a man whose name was etched on every whiplash of the fields, looked at the dusk of Caleb's jawline with an odd sharpness. Men who manage often see in others' faces what they do not want to face in themselves, the possibility of disorder. And the logic that rules such houses is not one of clarity. It is a logic of preemption, of removing any possibility that a small looseness could turn into public embarrassment. The system preserves itself by finding and eliminating irregularities. For Amelia, the taste of that night returned to her in quiet moments. While sewing, while watching the servants fold the napkins, while gliding through the conservatory, smelling the jasmine that now seemed to her like a floral silence. She carried the memory like a small hot coal in her palm. There was shame in it, but it was not the kind the house would have conjured. It was the private shame of having moved against the script and feeling both thrill and terror. The thrill had not been a rejection of all else. It had been an experiment. The terror was not fanaticism. It was the knowledge that in a world of ledgers, some marks are permanent. Caleb returned to the fields and to the exacting rhythm of his days. He took his place in the rows and swung the machete with an efficiency that was almost prayer. There were, however, small moments when his hands would pause, as if searching for a pressure that was no longer there. He had learned to keep secrets by turning them into work. To save a memory is to spend it slowly across the months like a ration. Though the house attempted to fit that night into the many other nights it catalogued, something had shifted in the air that invited speculation. Whispers gather where light is scarce. The children's play in the servants' court became punctuated with looks. The cook's assistant, a woman named Jacintha, found an empty silk ribbon in the laundry, and knowing exactly what silk between sheets implied, folded it into a neat square. Her rumor is a living thing. It needs nourishment and will breed in the dark. Amelia stepped back into parlor life with visible artifice. She performed the role of the elegant wife with a more practiced fluency than before. She laughed well when the Baron told the same story for the third time. She was a finished product, yet in the evening she wandered to the balcony and let the rain scar the view until the cane looked like a watercolor of grief. She asked herself, without being able to answer, whether the small incandescent truth of the night counted for anything beyond its immediate pleasure. She asked whether a life could be held together by a single audacity. The first sign that the house would not allow a simple erasure came weeks later in a slow and subtle way. An overseer, one of those men who had no use for ambiguity, began to treat Caleb with an unusual coldness. It was nothing dramatic, a stare that found his back at odd hours, a reprimand that came with a particular emphasis on being on time, Men like the overseer have the gift of noticing what others do not, and making sure a correction is applied before rumor blooms into scandal. He did not yet know the truth. He suspected an unbalanced proximity. Suspicion is a spark. Then, on an afternoon when the sun lay low and hot and the air smelled of brewing molasses, Hortensia was sweeping the great hall when she found a small indent on the underside of a silk sleeve, an outline that could have been made by a finger pressing too long, a bruise in fabric. She did not announce it. Instead, she carried the sleeve to the room where Amélia rested and contemplated it like a woman deciding whether to preserve a secret or to speak. Hortensia had seen many women collapse under shame, and many men ignore their women's misery. She had, by long apprenticeship, learned that sometimes silence is a kindness and sometimes it is a dangerous collusion. Amélia saw the mark and understood. She had hoped that the house would be able to fold the night into its normal operations and let it die quietly. But marks do not always obey hopes. The house had ways of locating such things, and more importantly, of converting them into narrative. A mark on a sleeve could become a story that moved from kitchen to servants' quarters to overseer's hangout. Little fictions have a way of building themselves into an edifice. That night, rain again cut the world in half. Amélia sat alone and felt the bruise on her hand as if it had a voice. She replayed the night with cruelty and tenderness, alternating between a sense of having regained something raw and of having pushed herself into an act that might cost another man's life. It was a thought that knotted her like a thread caught in a seam. The house, she knew, could not abide such a risk. She felt for the first time the latent truth of the title she had spoken, not as a boast but as a prophecy. Saying no mercy had been meant to be an act of power. She felt suddenly a strange chill that whispered of reciprocal justice. In the fields, Caleb cleaned his tools slowly and heard a man in the overseer's camp mutter a name, an almost accusation, and the sound ricocheted. He looked up, meeting the man's eye, and found there a hardness that was nothing personal as much as it was procedural. The house had begun to register a discrepancy and would, as its first move, tighten the cords it had around men's necks. Preemptive violence is the system's language. It is what keeps the ledger balanced. Between the night and the morning, when the system would begin to move like a clock toward correction, there lingered a fragile hush. Amélia lived that hush like a foreign country. She was both exhilarated and afraid. She had acted outside her station, and for the first time felt the vertigo of that choice. She had tasted what it meant to hold a secret that might uproot a life. The rain kept falling in a steady insistence, as if it sought to cleanse not the fields, but meaning itself. In the kitchen, Jacintha folded the silk ribbon into a scrap of memory, and for reasons she could not explain, placed it in a small dark chest where servants kept mementos that were not to be aired. She felt, with a woman's instinct honed in houses where propriety is an instrument of power, that secrets are both currency and explosives. She, like others, would hold the secret until it had the right buyer. Amélia could not sleep that night. She dressed and walked by the window to watch the cane tilt in the wind. She felt her life as an object seen from the outside, a painting that would be judged by those who did not know the hand that had painted it. She had wanted to speak with a hard tongue and had done so. She had intended to render herself immune to pity in the way she had always believed men could be immune. She had not understood the law of reciprocity that governs the house. A command to receive no pity can, if spoken aloud, call down a host of mercilessness practiced by those who hold power. Saying no mercy could be read as asking for a different kind of tally, one that turns outward and seeks to eliminate the threat posed by the act itself. The thought came to her like a distant strike of thunder. She had invoked a phrase whose grammar might be used against someone else. She had wanted dominion over her own feeling, but now perceived that dominance as a dangerous contagion. The irony pressed quietly. In attempting to claim a moment of ungoverned desire, she had also lit a fuse that the house would watch for and wait for. The house is surgical in its corrections. When Caleb returned to his hut that night, he lay awake and counted the sounds the way a man counts steps home. He counted the wind in the thatch and the creak of a neighbor's door. He thought of the look Amélia had given him as he left the room. Gratitude, perhaps, and a rational sorrow. He thought of the risk he had accepted by stepping into the house's geometry. He would not have thought of it as betrayal, because in the world he inhabited the deepest betrayals were the ones inflicted by law and ledger. The night had been an event that he would tuck away, like a sharp stone in his pocket. He imagined wearing it against his thigh like a story he might tell in a voice that was not for polite company. The rain lasted until dawn. It washed the cane leaves in the fields and left the ground smelling like the bones of the land. It seemed, to those who believed weather had intention, to have cleansed nothing at all. The house opened its shutters to a world that looked crisp and dishonest. Life resumed its script. The servants took up their duties. The Baron read his accounts. And beneath the surface there lay a thin, combustible new thing, the knowledge that the house could find and punish a deviance it deemed dangerous. Amélia wandered through the rooms like a woman watching her own portrait be rearranged. The mark on her palm ached faintly, and when she pressed at it she found the skin already wanting to betray her. She had said no mercy. She had not imagined that such a line could be replayed by the state of the house to justify a cruelty aimed at others. Her defiance had been private, she told herself, and therefore safe. But privacy in that house was always a fragile fiction. A small evidence, an unguarded footprint in the stairwell, a smear of cane on a towel, could be enough to set the mechanism in motion. She made herself attend that afternoon's music lesson, and though her piano fingers moved correctly, her mind kept returning to the geometry of the field where Caleb worked. She wondered, not for the first time, what it would mean to live in a world where a man like him could be more than a figure in the distance. The thought was an ache that had no remedy. As the light began to fold into the late hours, an overseer passed through the servants' quarter with a purposeful gait. He had a habit of taking stock in small ways, and his eyes stopped on Caleb as if measuring a weight. Caleb met his glance and said nothing. The exchange, like weather changing, would have been unremarkable if not for the way small unremarkable things accumulate until the edifice they support begins to tilt. That evening, as thunder rolled distant and the world seemed to hold its breath, Amélia sat at the balcony and said aloud to herself the phrase she had spoken that night. It was like testing a blade against the tongue. I said, "No mercy or pity." This time, the words came not triumphant, but as a report. She did not know yet that language had already begun to make its way into the ledger of the plantation, where every deviation is eventually recorded and where the house will always choose to correct. When the servants extinguished the lamps and the house closed into itself like a mouth, the world outside remained open and wet. The rain had stopped, but the fields glistened with it, and the air was heavy with the smell of turned earth. Little signals moved through the senzala like insects, the flick of a skirt, the low laugh of a child, the soft mutter of two women comparing a seam. There was, beneath it all, a sense of expectation. A week later, that expectation would find texture. But for the moment in the soggy dawn where the cane bowed and the sky remained a pale, reluctant blue, the line Amélia had drawn across her life still existed as possibility. She had wanted a night of ungoverned feeling. For the night she had it. She had been brave and foolish and incandescent and afraid. The house, patient and old, began to prepare its disapproval. It had not begun in loud, immediate ways. The first motions of a system toward correction are surgical, meant to be seen then unsee. A glance, a tightened line of the mouth, an overseer who is exceptionally punctual, a servant who makes a small mistake and is admonished in private. Each of these is a stitch. The stitching would in time become binding. For now, only the people who sleep in the margins felt the buzz of it. Amélia pressed her palm to the window pane and watched a lone figure in the distance tilt his head toward the east, where the river cut a ribbon through the land. The man was Caleb. He had not yet been incorporated into any ledger of punishment. He had simply returned to the field, to his work, to the unromantic way of surviving. But in the house, the seed of rumor had already begun to darken like a bruise beneath the skin. The night had been closed behind a door, but doors in such houses cannot keep the air from leaking. The smell of an action travels. That afternoon, at the sound of a bell, people moved like actors following the stage directions of a long-running play. Amélia moved too, playing the role she had long trained for, yet under that trained performance, something else glinted. an understanding that the thing she had done could not be dissolved by etiquette alone. There are consequences that move slow but do not forget. In the Cenzala, a child hummed a tune while rolling a piece of sugarcane between his fingers. His mother watched him with eyes that had the knowledge of a woman who has learned the impossible arithmetic that turns hands into profit and children into small accounts. She did not know the night's full story. She only knew the shape of hunger, when it takes, and when it demands repayment. The story that had been made in the Velvet Room would, in a way that was brutal but inevitable, travel across those households and arrive at the doors that keep the system intact. For now the rain had done what rain always does. It washed and left behind signs. The house returned to its liturgies and tried, with the force of custom, to fold the incident back into itself as if nothing of substance had changed. But marks remained. Words that have been spoken can be taken down as minutes. Nights that have been lived do not always know how to be fully erased. Amelia, who had thought that pronouncing no mercy or pity was an act of sovereign will, discovered in the hollow afterward that a sovereign can summon consequences they will never fully bear. For the moment, she sat with that ambiguity and let it roll over her like a second rain, cool, penetrating, unresolved. If this opening unsettles you, leave a single word below, something that stayed with you when the rain washed across the tiles. The thin hush that followed the night of silk and rain did not last. Months wore the hush like a seamstress presses a fold, with insistence, until the shape is inevitable. Amelia felt the change at first as a private disturbance, an appetite that left her faint in a way she had not memorized, a ribbon of odd fatigue threading her afternoons. The house, which kept so many clocks tuned to propriety, noticed irregularities in quieter instruments, the way the hem of a dress lay, the careful misplacement of a glove, the neat seamstress's hand finding an extra breadth of cloth in a gown that had been fitted only last week. Hortensia watched, and with the refined cruelty of those who survive by reading signs, she began to stitch a new map. She did not hurry to voice it. First came small acts, a sweet kept from the lady's tray, a loose pin left to be found, a line of soot on a curtain where none belonged. Then one morning, as dawn diffracted into the conservatory, she found what she feared, an altered outline beneath the silk, an ever-so-slight rounding that a practiced eye could not mistake. She handed Amelia a cup of water, and with the gentleness of someone who had learned to disguise orders as counsel, said, "Go slow with the news, señorita. Take care of yourself." Amelia became a woman who could count hours by the tide of worry in her wrists. She dressed with new deliberation, keeping gloves clean and hands away from the public eye. At dinner she laughed as before, but the note clipped in the middle betrayed her. She moved through rooms like a lookout who believes a storm is coming and wonders where it will break. Joachim, for his part, accepted the liminal space of a wife's pallor as one of those domestic inconveniences that appetite and the seasons explained. He spoke less of heirs and more of land improvements, but his complacency carried the same confidence. The house would correct anything that looked askew. Rumor, when it arrives in a household, is not a single animal, but a maelstrom gathered from many small winds. It moves from the cook's hearth to the nursery, from the men who sharpen hooks to the women who braid hair. Jacintha folded the silk ribbon and, with the tiny heroics of servants who save things that might prove useful, placed it as a talisman in the back of a drawer. The overseer, who had long seen in Caleb the efficiency of a hand, began to measure his gait as if taking the pulse of potential disorder. The ledger of the house does not tolerate anomalies for long. It incubates suspicion until suspicion becomes a reason. When it came, the discovery was not melodramatic. No thunderclap of confession, no dramatic reveal before the sitting room. The day the child showed proof, it happened in a quiet way that made the crime of the household feel almost petty. A visiting relative, the sort that came with keys and lent gravitas, noticed the child's hand as he passed, a dark knuckle, a curl of hair that did not wholly conform to Joachim's line. Children, in their indifference, admix features with candor. The newborn's face, still puffy with first breaths, carried a persistent stubbornness that struck a looker as odd. In the room where the Baron and his household sat like a small court, An expression passed across Joachim's face that was not simply astonishment, but a slippage into anger that tightened like a fist. The reaction was swift and surgical because the plantation's economy depended on appearances. Joachim's voice, when he finally spoke, was the sound of a ledger that had been punctured. "Explain," he said, and for the first time his eyes reached Amélia with something like aim. The parlor, for a span of breaths, resembled a dock where judgment was weighed. Amélia, hearing her husband's tone, felt each word as if it were a small blow. She could have tried to mount a defense of silence, to let the household construct the comfortable fictions it preferred. Instead, mortality and maternal terror braided, and in a short, frantic knot, she offered a lie that the house required, that the child was Joachim's. Hortensia assisted with the deception because women in those rooms know the economies of shame. They know what will break a household and what will merely bruise it. She coached Amélia in gestures, the manner of a mother's hold, the vocabulary of a woman who had labored to appear overwhelmed rather than ashamed. The lie was not hard to perform. People prefer comfortable stories. Joachim accepted the surface with the relief of a man who believes his line intact. But a lie cannot alter a body. Paternity is not a matter of speech. It is written in pigment and bone, and the invisible ledger of resemblance. The evidence, however, arrived in a form that the house had not foreseen, the child's skin, a breadth and hue that could not be accounted for simply as variation. Eyes, too, carried secrets. A cousin leaning in to coo at the infant saw, in the flicker of light, a pair of eyes that held a greenish tint, different enough to register and different enough to spark a rumor. Any small thing became a currency. Men who managed land and people have procedures to neutralize such currencies. They are prudent because a scandal erases profits as surely as a hurricane does fields. Joachim's response contained within it the plantation's disciplinary grammar. He did not search for legal recourse. He executed immediate sentences. He summoned the overseer, who liked to think of himself as the house's muscle, and told him plainly what he suspected. The overseer, who had been sharpening corrections in his mind ever since the night of the rain, took the command as a warrant. For the system, speed is essential. Rumor allowed to circulate morphs into contagious truth. Whippings are a way to reassert the ledger's authority. They do not seek confession. They bake obedience into bodies. Caleb understood the direction of the house long before the first lash fell. His life had taught him how the smallest perceptions could be turned into legalities against him. When the overseer's men came in the dusk, two broad-shouldered figures who moved like the institution itself, Caleb met them with a quiet that is not stoicism, but survival. He was taken without a parade of formal accusations, because in those rooms evidence is social and immediate. They led him to a yard where the whip, an instrument more of the field than of law, was readied. The whipping is not a performance for the house's benefit. It is a practical lesson. Sound will travel through the thatch and become its own testimony. The whip snapped, not purposefully, but with the mechanical efficiency of a factory instrument. Flesh is a ledger that records differently than ink. Caleb's back took the punishment, and with each stripe he catalogued the world anew. Names he had been given, trades he'd been sold through, a brother he would not see again. Pain does not always make sound. Sometimes it makes the eyes become maps of memory. Amélia, in the household's parlor, heard the crack as a distant foreign noise and felt it in her like a tremor. She could not see the man she had touched being punishmented, but the house has methods that ensure even indirect witnesses are complicit in their sorrow. She clutched a cloth to her mouth and understood with an ugly clarity that the ledger would always find a body on which to write its corrections. Her lie had wanted to secure her own place. Instead, it had produced corporal reckoning for another. The truth of the house is that it trades in human costs with a numb economy. After the whipping, the decision to remove Caleb was not debated. The fighter arranged transport with brisk hands. There are places the owners send men when they wish to be rid of problem and proof. Mines in Minas Gerais that eat years, and autos and names. Fazendas farther inland where distance and lack of record make disappearance neat. Caleb was stripped of any bearing that could anchor him in the household's map. The men assigned him a new name for travel, an erasure cloaked in administrative language, and drove him from the familiar paths into a country that measured time in the ache of labor. The trafficking of punishment is both logistical and poetic. It severs. They took the child as well, though not immediately. Joachim wanted to ensure no story circulated. The baby, whose first cries had been a private, fragile thing, was removed from the nursery and placed among the Cenzala under the pretense of care and protection. In truth, it was a removal to erase evidence. Amelia's protests, silent then louder, met with the cool arithmetic of men who run houses built on human property. For propriety, they said. For control, the real motto, they did not need to say. Amelia's punishment was not court-martial nor public shaming in the way a peasant would suffer. Instead, she was deemed unfit to stay in the house as a free woman who could perform her duties. In the plantation's world, the method of disciplining an aristocratic transgressor is to fold her into a different institution that will enforce silence, the convent. It is an exile with a rosary and stitched habits, a silence signed in cloth. Hortensia, torn between loyalty to the household and care for the woman she had tutored, accompanied Amélia to the carriage that took her away under the cover of dawn. The exile was clothed as mercy. Caleb's journey to the mines became an itinerary of imposed anonymity. The miners called him by his travel name. Guards spoke in terms of productivity. Days elongated into one steady rhythm: dig, haul, mend. There were seasons when entire arms of the body ached, as if the world itself had become a tool. He worked under a tropical sun that scoured skin and under a sky that did not keep promises. In those years he learned to count by small mercies. A bowl of soup that was not cold, the fact of waking with joints that still moved. Memory of the night with Amélia lived with him like an object carried for warmth. It was a warmth and a wound. Years in the mines are more than physical labor. They are a training in endurance of erasure. Men there find ways to funeral their names by saying them in secret, by keeping small rituals, how they light a cigarette, how they touch a mark on a wrist. Caleb made himself small but not invisible. He found a pattern of companionship with other men who were sold from houses with similar economies. They traded scraps of song and stories of children left behind. In those moments, his sense of being a man who had been seen as more than muscle persisted as something fragile but alive. There were times he would stand in the wash of rain after a storm and feel the memory of a silk sleeve against his skin, as if the earth itself had stored impressions. As for Amélia, the convent received her like a patient to be catalogued. The abbess, who had seen such arrivals before, offered sacraments and a set of rules intended to replace voice with obedience. Silence in the convent is not natural, it is cultivated. Amélia learned the cadence of sanctioned emptiness, long hours of prayer, the slow work of needle and thread, the measured ritual of meals. Her days became a ledger of devotions, small, precise acts that filled hours but did not heal. She could not be shamed more publicly than she had been, yet the exile carried a humiliation that corrupted the marrow. In the flicker of cell light, she spoke to herself, and sometimes spoke aloud, that line she had once uttered as a dare. No mercy, no pity. Now it tasted different, less an experiment and more a premonition. Within the Cenzala, the removed child, named Miguel by the women who raised him, grew wrapped in silence and in stories the household would rather not tell. Miguel learned early that inheritance is an odd thing. It is not only land or title, but the shapes of story that pass in low voices. He had no knowledge of the exact origin of his features, only the small inheritance of manner and song given by the women who bathed him and taught him how to steal a piece of corn without drawing a hand. He grew up with the economy of attention that many children in such households learn. It is better to be useful than dangerous, better to be quick with a grin than with an answer. Time did what time always does. It carried the plantation and its people through events the personal could not wholly control. Emancipation arrived like a clumsy statute, a decree that unclipped chains but left tongues and markets intact. Men who had been property became, by a stroke of law, freedmen, yet legal change did not instantly translate into social mobility. The ledger of prejudice had been inked deeper than statutes could erase. Caleb, after decades in the mines, was finally granted alforria in technical terms, and yet freedom was not returned as a single certificate. It unfolded as a landscape to navigate with bruised limbs. He returned to the delta of his origins in the way a man returns to an island he once knew, one foot in the past and the other uncertain. The house that had been the axis of his life seemed both smaller and more monstrous. Joachim's estate was altered by time. Fields shifted hands. Some buildings had been torn down, but the architecture of power persisted in gestures and in the split of who ate meat and who ate cassava. Caleb came back, changed by the mines. The skin remained a map, but there was a new economy in his walk. He who had been made to labor without rest now moved like a man who had been taught the language of endurance. Miguel, now a young man, had learned crafts and trades in the Chenzala and beyond. He listened to stories by lantern light, tales of a woman in velvet who had once moved differently, stories recounted in hushed, reverential voices by aged aunts who remembered more than they spoke. The green eyes motif, Amelia's unknown echo, appeared unexpectedly in his own family when his daughter Benedita arrived with irises the color of a fogged lake. In a society that prized lineage as both commodity and taboo, those eyes were a private signal that opened and closed like a fist. Benedita's green eyes were not, in themselves, proof of anything to those who understood the ledger. To the house, eyes were not currency, but to heraldry of memory they became a key. In the Chenzala, older women would lean toward her and, in the low cadence of women who keep long histories, murmur that she carried an inheritance that could not be sold away. Benedita grew into her eyes with a quiet pride and a restless intelligence. She learned how to read faces, how to take measure of a room, and how to refuse being an object of curiosity. In her, the genealogy of secrecy acquired a face that noticed the world. José, later perhaps the grandson in the line, became a teacher in a small provincial school. He taught reading and arithmetic, and in time subtler things, the ethics of telling truth, the art of listening to stories that would not be easy to hear. He was the sort of man who believed that names deserve to be recovered, because names anchor the living to memory and to place. José's vocation was both practical and moral. He taught children how to form letters, and in the margins how to write the history their elders had been denied. Across generations, the line between silence and truth shifted like sediment. Some chose to keep secrets because silence had a protective logic, safety in not being seen. Others, like José, believed that the truth, once spoken, had a power that could untether the weight carried in shoulders. He argued in modest ways at first for the ethics of acknowledgement. If the plantation had been built on hidden liaisons, it was only fair that those liaisons be named. His voice was not singular. It was part of a slow chorus of descendants who wanted not revenge but recognition. Caleb, when he finally died, after a brief period of being free but exhausted by the years, left a body that bore records no law could properly heal, ribbed scars across the back, hands calloused into a map of labor, a voice that often carried the silence of long remembrance. His death was small and private. He did not achieve the heroics that abolitionists in the city credited to freedom. Instead, he died as a man who had been wanted and punished, who had lived the staggering contradiction of being seen in a house and then erased from it. Those who remembered him were few but faithful. Benedita, as a child, had heard his name folded into lullabies. José later catalogued it in a ledger of family memory and insisted the family keep it. Amelia lingered in the convent like a scent in an old drawer, faint, undeniable. Her hands grew more precise in the embroidery she was assigned to make. Her voice, once practiced for drawing a room's sympathy, grew thin. She wrote in stolen scraps and with small private fury, letters she never sent. Once she attempted to speak the phrase that had caused so much to tilt, not as a command but as a question. No mercy. Did I ask for none? She pinched the paper between fingers that had once smoothed linen and felt the sting of the open wound she had helped open in another's back. The convent offered her prayers. It could not refurbish her conscience. When her death came, it was not loud. It was a quiet unthreading. There were no grand goodbyes, only a bell and a record and a body laid out in prayers that attempted to make amends. The household fell into its own transformations. Joachim, diminished by time and by the slow erosion of plantations under market changes, died in a room smelling of port and black ink. His face, the one that had once been a slab of wood, softened into the worn planes of later age. The ledger that had guided his life outlived him, but names shift in the ledger's columns like migrating birds. Some accounts remained open: debts, relationships, unspoken harms. History, as it moves, rearranges the architecture of private lives into public narrative. Abolition did not cause a sudden epiphany for the nation. It made visible certain hypocrisies and left others to ossify. People who had once been owned became citizens in law, yet continued to shoulder invisible charges. The descendants of Miguel and Benedita, teachers, tailors, midwives, began to populate the city streets. There they learned the complicated craft of surviving in a republic that had been built in part on the silence of their grandparents. Names acquired new contexts, and green eyes became less a curiosity than a quiet reminder that heredity refuses to be sanitized. An epilogue of sorts gathers itself naturally, not as a tidy enclosure, but as a meditation on what one night of yearning can do when placed inside a structure that prizes property over persons. The night when Amélia had said, "No mercy, no pity," was a fracture in her life and in the lives around her. The command, intended to sever the soft adherence of propriety, sparked a retribution that was not only physical, but also administrative and moral. The house's punishment did not reform anything. It simply redistributed suffering. Consider the way pain moves across generations. Caleb's back carried stripes that would not be read as injustice by the ledgers that profited from his labor. Miguel's body carried the cultural ambivalence of a child raised in both worlds, but claimed by neither. Benedita's eyes carried a green that resisted tidy categorization. Jose taught children to read names, and thus to read their own stories back into existence. Each gesture of memory, retelling, naming, keeping a photograph, preserving a name on a rotted family Bible, became a counter-technology to the house's desire to erase. There is also the matter of how silence functions. In some cases, silence protects. In others, silence compounds harm. Amelia's vow of secrecy had not preserved her. It had placed the weight of atonement on others. Saying no mercy as a private act of sovereignty had fed a public appetite for mercilessness that the plantation wielded like currency. The title line, first a defiant edict, morphed into a grim epitaph that described more than one person's fall. In a small study in a town many years later, Jose pinned to his wall a simple list of names: Amélia Vasconcelos de Andrade, Caleb, Miguel, Benedita. He wrote beside them the places they had lived, and the brief notations of how they had been remembered, and, crucially, how they had been forgotten by institutions. He was not a historian in the academic sense. He was a keeper of family ethics. For him, truth-telling was not revenge. It was a form of repair, imperfect and iterative. When he told the story in the classroom or at a modest town meeting, he did so carefully, because history demands nuance. He would say, in a voice that paused to let the air soundtrack what names could not fully bear, that desire is complicated by the architecture of power in which it occurs, that to consent is not the same as to possess liberty. He taught that cruelty administered by institutions can wear the face of propriety. Students would ask bluntly, "Was she guilty?" Jose would answer, "She was a woman who attempted a private experiment in a house that punished private experiments by making them public sins." In public memory, the story altered as it traveled. Some retellings turned it into gossip, some into a morality tale about aristocratic frivolity, but descendants insisted on nuance. Benedita, later in life, held her grandchildren and told them that their green eyes did not make them curiosities, they made them witnesses. She taught that the body can hold records, and that those records, when read honestly, can become a source of responsibility. Her instruction was practical. Know ancestors' names, keep evidence. Listen to the older women in your family because they remember what the books sometimes choose to ignore. Caleb's grave, if there was a grave known to family memory, was marked by a rock with a small hand-carved notch. It was enough, less a monument than a gesture. The notch signified a life that had been marked in ways records would not always honor. Amelia's memorial in the convent was simple, a stone with a name. It did not fully account for the lives that had suffered because of her choices, but neither did the house that had punished them give them voice. The tension remains. The final and perhaps hardest lesson of this history is moral. Systems pay in other people's bodies. When Amélia sought an ungoverned night and spoke the words that would become a prophecy, she did not intend the larger harm. But intent is not the currency history accepts. The plantation, Joachim, the overseer, the fighter, translated a private transgression into public discipline. A woman's attempt at a moment of undefended humanity led to a man's decades of labor and a child's removal from the only mother he might remember. The irony is bitter. The demand for no mercy brought forth mercilessness, and the woman who demanded hardness found herself outwardly punished into silence. There is, though, an ethic that emerges from the wreckage, truth as remedy. It is not a cure for past wounds, those cannot be wholly healed, but the act of naming restores a thread to the fabric of memory. José, by teaching and naming, refused to let the ledger alone write history. Benedita, by claiming her eyes as inheritance rather than shame, altered how her children would think of themselves. Caleb's story, when told, turned a ledger entry into a human voice. Memory, when shared, loosens the tight calculus that allows injustice to be mistreated as an administrative necessity. So the final echo of the title must arrive, not as a triumph, but as a lament and a warning. Amelia's phrase, "I said no mercy or pity," remains a slash across the narrative, both incitement and indictment. It got spoken in a bedroom trying to reclaim feeling, and it returned her to a life of being incapable of sitting comfortably in the world. Not in the literal sense of immobilization, but in the moral sense of being rendered powerless to claim the consequences she had set loose. The very handful of agency she thought she exercised vanished into the same system that could punish more than the guilty. In the end, the story asks for a practice that is modest but consequential. To remember, to name, to refuse the ease of forgetting. It asks that we recognize the ways private acts unfold inside public architectures, and that we refuse to let institutions convert personal transgression into communal punishment without acknowledgement. Remembering is not a rhetorical flourish. It is the first step toward an ethic that says the ledger must include more than profits and births. It must include the cost paid by bodies. If this story moved you, share it with someone who will listen and keep it in the company of names. Speak it aloud in a small circle. Memory survives in speech as much as in stone.